Within the cerebral hemispheres, we have the frontal lobe, which is located just deep to the frontal bone, and it forms the anterior portion of the cerebral hemisphere. It's going to end posteriorly at the central sulcus, and the inferior border would be at the lateral sulcus. Posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe, and it's under the parietal bone, and it has general sensory functions. The third lobe is the temporal lobe. It's inferior to the lateral sulcus, and it's under the temporal bone. The fourth lobe is the occipital lobe, underneath the occipital lobe. So those four lobes are pretty easy to identify, especially because you know the cranial bones at this point. The fifth bone is the one that is deep to the lateral sulcus and can only be seen if the other lobes are retracted. Within the brain lies central white matter, and that's deep to the cortical gray matter. And there are three different types of white matter. Again, we know that it is white matter because they are myelinated axons. So those axons are bundled into tracts of three different types. A tract is referring to axons. The three examples are association tracts, and they are within one hemisphere. So we can see association tracts as these two different examples. You don't need to know the names of them, just know what an association tract is. The commissural tracts connect two hemispheres, and the example of this would be the corpus callosum. So you should know that specific name. The third example of a tract would be a projection tract, and it connects the cerebrum to lower areas. For example, the spinal cord. Within the cerebrum are basal nuclei, which are these collections of gray matter. They're almost like islands of gray matter located deep within the brain's white matter. So in this location, or in this cadaver image, a transverse image, we are seeing specifically basal nuclei. It's not important that you know the specific names for the basal nuclei, but as we zoom in a little more on this coronal section, we can see the outer cortex, which is the gray matter, the corpus callosum, which is that tract, that commissural tract which connects the right and the left hemisphere, the lateral ventricle, and the septum pellucidum is the membrane that separates the two lateral ventricles, the thalamus, part of the diencephalon, the lateral sulcus, which is separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe would be inferior to the lateral sulcus. The insula, that's that deep lobe, which we cannot see unless the other lobes are retracted. Third ventricle, hypothalamus, part of the diencephalon. And then these are the various basal nuclei or cerebral nuclei. And as I mentioned, you don't need to know these specific names, so just ignore those specific names. Let's look at the diencephalon, the next major region of the brain. So we've covered the cerebrum. Now the diencephalon is going to have three major parts to it. It has the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland. The next part of the diencephalon is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And anatomically, it's located in the third ventricle. So as we zoom in on this diagram, we see the corpus callosum at the very top, right above where the diencephalon is located at. Within the diencephalon would be the thalamus, the epithalamus, which is the pineal gland, and the hypothalamus. So there are three parts of the diencephalon to know. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, a hormone that regulates what's called our circadian rhythm. A circadian rhythm is natural rhythms that occur in our body. The example in this case would be the natural rhythm that kind of tells our body when to go to sleep. So again, you can see the highlighted regions of the diencephalon in this diagram. The thalamus is groups of gray matter on each side of the third ventricle. Again, you don't have to know all of the names of these various gray matter, but you should know that it's a main relay point for sensory information that will be projected to the somatosensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe. So a good way that you can think of the job of the thalamus is that it sort of receives all kinds of incoming information from the rest of the body and decides where to send it. The analogy that I like to think of it as is the librarian who's responsible for looking at all the books that come into the library, and then he or she decides where to put those books, where to send them in the parts of the library being the brain. Another part, and the last part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. And again, you don't need to know the different parts of the hypothalamus. These are the various nuclei in it that are shown here. So all this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, one of the big job is that it's in charge of the pituitary gland, a gland that you'll learn a lot more about in the endocrine system. So it's the last part of the diencephalon. It's the master control of the autonomic nervous system, specifically our fight or flight nervous system. The endocrine system, it's our body's thermostat, controls water intake, and also regulation of sleep, which is our circadian rhythms. The next region of the brain is called the brainstem, and it contains many autonomic and reflex centers required for survival. And its three regions are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And below the medulla oblongata would be the spinal cord. So the brainstem is shown on this image here, and it contains the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. The diencephalon is superior to that, so I'll use a different color, and it contains the thalamus, the pineal gland, which is the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus, which you can't see here. On the image that is to the right here, on this specific cadaver image, this would be the most superior portion of the brainstem called the midbrain. The midbrain has the cerebral aqueduct that extends through it, which connects the third and the fourth ventricles. It has a region called the substantia nigra, which produces dopamine. And oftentimes the substantia nigra is the problem when patients have Parkinson's disease. The midbrain also contains regions called the superior and inferior colliculi, which are basically reflex centers. The superior colliculus is the visual reflex center, and the inferior colliculus is the auditory reflex center. All four of these bumps, there's two in the superior colliculus, two in the inferior colliculus. All four of those bumps together are called the corpora quadrigemina.